Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I hope you can hear me well here today. And with me, I have Dr. Jenine Beekhuyzen from Adroit Research. And today we're going to be talking about the 4 pillars of survey design. To start with, I'd like to introduce myself and give Jenine also opportunity to introduce herself. So I'm Alyona Medelyan, and I'm the CEO of Thematic. I have spent the past 15 years in research and development. I have a dual degree in linguistics and computer science, and I've worked on very interesting projects at companies like Google, Cisco, various startups before I started Thematic about 3 years ago. Jenine, over to you.
Thanks, Alyona. Dr. Jenine Beekhuyzen, and I am the founder and CEO of Adroit Research, and we specialize in improving the quality and reputation of qualitative research. And of course, we've moved into mixed method research with the proliferation of survey data and other types of data being collected. My background's in information technology and information systems, and I'm excited to be here today to answer and share some ideas.
Thank you so much. A bit of history. Jenine and I met about 8 years ago at an event organized by Google in Sydney, Australia. And I was really impressed by Janine's passion for qualitative research and getting deep insights from data. So I thought, after getting so many requests from companies, helping them design their surveys, design their questions, she would be a great person to talk about this. So she suggested this outline. Jenine, may I ask you to talk a little bit about these 4 pillars for successful survey design?
Sure, thanks, Alyona. Planning is key, and if we don't plan, we plan to fail. I'm a big fan of thinking of the end point and then taking a plan and working out how do we get there. So I think even thinking of analyze at the beginning, what insights would we like to get, and then how do we design our questions, our timing, our delivery so that we can achieve those outcomes. So part of that obviously is spending quite a bit of time in planning. So we're going to talk about that now in terms of the types of questions and how to propose the design, but then also remembering that who our audience is, who our customers are, and what kind of insights we want along the way. Okay, I think it's a great place to start thinking about how happy are your customers or your clients or your staff, depending on who it is you are surveying. Usually what we want to know is their positive or negative experiences with something. So what is it that they actually want rather than what you actually want? And I think we need to find somewhere in the middle. Often we go out with a certain assumptions in mind of what we'd like to know. And that's fine, but we need to think about, is that all we want to know, or do we want to give our participants more of an opportunity to share ideas rather than just the ones we ask them for? We need to get to know them as much as possible and what it is they need. Some people are shy in telling you these things, others are more forward. So I guess we need to provide an environment where everybody feels comfortable to share their ideas. And again, what is it you really want to know? So we're going to talk about different strategies for only including what you want to know, because it's very easy to include superfluous information that seems to be useful, but it may actually be a drawback in terms of people completing the survey. And as mentioned, are we just confirming what we already know or what we think we want to know, or are we interested in actually delving further and asking people what they think a bit more generally? So a couple of tips for our survey planning. Pretty much every source says we need to keep it short. So part of that is only including those questions that you're actually going to use, even though there may be others that seem useful. Maybe we don't actually need them as part of this process and we can get the info elsewhere. Using open-ended questions first to avoid enforcing some of those assumptions we may have. Often we start with a few checkboxes or drop-down lists. This can be a little bit intimidating for survey respondents, and by starting with an open question, it's inviting. It feels to the participant like people want to hear what they have to say. And thinking about what are the main problems, again, often we add these extra questions that don't necessarily contribute to the main problem that we want to know. So making sure we stay right on focus, and even if it is only 3 questions that we ask, they could be 3 really fantastic questions. And thinking about, again, the purpose. Are we trying to find out information, or could we use the survey or the data collection tool as a way of presenting solutions to our audience and getting feedback in a really useful way? So some of that consultation kind of process. I think something else really important to consider is the mechanics of the survey, which of course we'll talk more about. But in terms of the planning, what time of the day do you plan to send your survey out? Is it first thing in the morning when your staff are excited to be at work and more likely to fill it in? Is it a Friday afternoon when people are finding they have less to do and they need to fill a bit of time, so maybe that's the best time to do the survey? So really considering when your audience is most likely to reply to your survey to increase your response rate, and giving them an opportunity to do it at their leisure in the time that suits them. There's a lot of discussion around incentives. Should we provide incentives to our participants? There is research that says, done well, it shouldn't impact, having an incentive shouldn't impact or skew our results. However, it's something we certainly need to keep in mind. I think what we need to do, or what the research says we need to do, is consider an incentive. So does everyone get the incentive for participating, or do we do some kind of lottery style where you're in a draw for an incentive? But if done well, it shouldn't change the reliability of the data that we collect. But thinking about what incentives might encourage your participants mostly to respond to the questions that you're asking them.
I get asked this question quite a lot. When companies don't get a lot of responses to their Net Promoter Score surveys, for example, and it's such a key performance indicator for many companies, they are wondering if they should offer a 10% discount on the subscription or some other type of incentive. And the research says that it can skew the scores. But at the same time, in really surveys are not really as much about the scores rather than about the insights that come through the open-ended question. And this is something, Jenine, you told me before when we discussed this. As long as you keep it consistent, it should work, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it comes back to the good old what's in it for me. And if we carefully consider what is in it for our participants. So we need to give them an incentive to participate, whether it's monetary or just being part of the conversation, that may be enough.
Here's actually a really interesting example on how Airbnb incentivizes its customers to leave feedback. And what they do is they basically say, you won't find out what your host said until you fill out your review, which I think is quite clever.
I agree.
And then what happens is also the whole an approach to encourage filling out the surveys through the way of how you're actually writing the email invite. So here, as you can see, is a little picture of the apartment in which I actually stayed not that long ago. So by receiving this in my email, I have an emotional connection to that particular email, and I'm more likely, therefore, to fill it out. And notice how they're even using the word "you" a lot in the following text, and they're really writing in a very simple and short way. So then once you click through, there is again something very simple. Tell the next guest what you loved and anything else you should know about this place, and reminding people that it's a public review, just putting it into the actual open-ended bar and then thanking them in a very simple way, saying that what the feedback is used for.
I really like this, Alyona. A couple of things here. They're also saying we a lot, so not just you, but we. So there's a kind of relationship implied there. So there's mutual benefit, which I think is quite interesting. The mix of the closed-ended and open-ended question on one page, I think, is also quite well done. So you don't have to scroll, you don't have to go further to get to put your information in. And what's interesting also with the stars that they're using, I guess we see those stars as ratings in lots of different ways. So rather than having a tick box or a like it scale, which we'll talk more about, but having the stars, I think, is something very familiar. And I know with one survey that I've done longitudinally for 10 years with young people, with teenage girls, we've actually moved to having emojis instead of stars. So the frowny emoji up to the smiley emoji and places in between. For that audience, we found that that was particularly appealing rather than tick a box or stars.
Great. Questioning the questions. I like this title.
I do as well, and I think we've touched on it. What we're trying to say here is that really consider those non-useful questions where you could have got the information elsewhere, and really think about the wording of the question, and does it appeal to your audience? I've certainly been in situations where the wording can make a big difference in terms of how people respond. So of course, if you can have an option to pilot your questions with a small group of people, I would highly, highly recommend that. You don't want people to not respond simply because they didn't understand a question or understand it in the way you expected them to. So questioning the question, Alyona and I talked about a lot of superfluous information that does get included that could be left out to encourage people to respond more regularly, and that is information around people's gender, ethnicity, their background, their age, their years of experience, what kind of products they're using, how long they've been a customer, things like their email address. Well, they probably have your survey because you've emailed them to start with. So that kind of information can be sourced elsewhere, and it really does distract the reader from completing the survey.
Great, and we're at our second pillar, design. So making sure that you receive authentic survey responses and the results aren't skewed or messy.
So this is where we're thinking about the endpoint and what kind of answers do we want, and we usually don't ask a question unless we know the type of answer that we want. There's different ways to present answers or possible answers, as you can see from the left to the right. Given that the intensity increases on either end of the midpoint, we can infer that important is intended to convey less intensity than very important, and more intensity than slightly important. But technically speaking, very important and slightly important are both sub-classifications of important. So that means that the wording could confuse some respondents and hurt your data accuracy. So how do we avoid this kind of problem? What the research suggests is that we explicitly label each scale point with an appropriate modifier. So the example here, I think, is a really good one. So you can see quite important, somewhat important, important, slightly. They're kind of all the same to me as a user. Whereas extremely is very different to moderately as opposed to slightly. So I think you'll agree with us that the example on the right is a much clearer way of presenting the options. The open and closed-ended argument debate, I think the example you had earlier, Alyona, was very helpful from Airbnb, which showed the combination of opened and closed. And we talked about the idea of having an open question first to open the floor up, essentially, to let people share their views, and then we guide them to other things that we would like to know. Of course, there are pros and cons to each. Open-ended will give you more insights and more breadth, whereas closed-ended questions, they're easier to respond to. People can sort of tick and flick kind of thing, but then maybe they're not taken as seriously because they're much easier to do. So I guess what we're saying is you possibly need a balance. And if not a balance of the two, really think through what it is you want as an outcome and which is the most appropriate for that. Because, yeah, you will get different kinds of answers to each. To be honest, I would suggest that mix of questions like we saw before. It does appeal to different learning styles, and so it does provide a little bit of something for everybody. And if we only have closed-ended questions, it doesn't really give people an opportunity to share anything extra that they'd like to add. And having those multiple text boxes can be intimidating, and we will show you a few examples of data collection. And think for yourself, would this be an inviting way to share your feedback?
I actually just recently filled out a survey where I was presented with a wall of radio buttons, which yeah.
So how do you feel about that, Alyona? Would you feel confronted by something like that?
Well, I thought it was really difficult to separate the lines, so I was worried about making a mistake and putting the wrong button next to the wrong question. And this is actually not as bad there as some of the other ones I've seen, but in general, the other thing that concerned me is the don't know too soon to tell, where because they stick to the very poor, I feel like these are examples. This is where it's deteriorating basically, and again, it was a bit confusing.
I agree. I think there are better ways to do it. So in terms of scales, so often when we all probably have heard of a Likert scale. So the usual range is say 1 to 5. Sometimes it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 7. There are variations. As Alyona said before, I think consistency is absolutely key. And when people are faced with the example we just saw, or you have a Likert scale, or you have another option or another option, I think if we start to use a combination of different methods, that does confuse our participant. So I would say pick a style that suits you and your organization and stick with it, so that when we go back to people again and again, they're quite used to our formula. So on a scale to 1 to 5, I'll just mention 5 should always be good and 1 should always be bad. Again, the consistency so people can identify with that. A couple of other examples here. So I guess 3 types of scale questions are the yes, no, agree, disagree type checkbox or drop down. And there's no real nuance around those. It's either it's very black and white. No room for a maybe or maybe a neutral. In terms of the rating scales, NPS and the CSAT, so on a scale from 0 to 10, so this is where we have the spectrum, and we're trying to find where people feel themselves sitting along that spectrum. So it does allow for a range of answers. And I guess with our semantic differential scales, which you can see an example there, these really are the best for evaluating attitudes. You do get the most nuance in these. They may be a little bit harder to analyze, but certainly in terms of data capture, it gives you a better breadth of answers. So a couple of design tips checking in on step 2 here. I think it's really important to challenge your assumptions. It's tempting to make assumptions about why things are the way they are. For instance, why some teachers are excited about some educational technology and others aren't. There's a whole bunch of issues around access, skills, attitudes, abilities, which are quite complex, and usually there's more than meets the eye. So we try to collect data from as many people as we can to get different perspectives. Now, that's not always possible, of course, but at least trying to question why we're getting the responses that we are. Having multiple survey writers, I believe, can be really quite helpful. So when we create surveys, having people read each other's work and, as I said, test the questions out, it helps address the fact that most questions can be perceived of in more than one way. And you need to test the survey language among the survey writers and possibly some pilot people before we send this out to our survey population. It's also quite important to set reasonable expectations. So you should try to encourage the reluctant people to participate, as they add a very interesting and worthwhile perspective to the overall data picture. So those who generally never reply, how do we encourage and incentivize them to participate? Of course, we can't force people to participate, but we, of course, want to get a reasonable response rate so that we can feel comfortable and confident in the results that we present. We've talked a little bit about choosing survey questions carefully. I won't talk much more about that, only that make it count. Be as specific as possible with your survey questions and make sure you get to the heart of the issues that are important to your team. So write questions that make sense for your participants. And be prepared to report back. I'm often dismayed when I fill out a survey and I never hear anything after that in terms of where the results went or what the insights were. One incentive, I believe, is promising that you will share the results back, again, such as the Airbnb response before. So surveys often play a role at different stages throughout an evaluation process. So it might be from a baseline, it might be a planning process, it might be a measurement. So how can we take those elements and report them back to the people who are sharing their insights?
Great. And now we're at our third pillar, collecting the actual data and making sure you get the most data and the most out of your data. Collection tips. Here are the tips that, Jenine, you have put together, and I can't wait to hear them.
Yes, we try to think of your entire sample and who is part of that, and there may be different stakeholder groups within that. How we might need a different plan for different stakeholder groups to engage them. So again, it comes back to that, what's in it for me? I'm a big fan of that. If there's nothing in it for me that I can see value, I'm not going to participate. So whether it's an incentive, whether it's reporting back, whether it's seeing what other people have contributed, really considering what that incentive is for those different people in your wide audience. And the reason why we're collecting this data is because it's data that we can't directly observe. Within your organization, you quite possibly observe behavior on a daily basis and have informal conversations with people, but certainly it's very difficult to capture and measure that. Often what people say and what they do are quite different things, and that's why mixed method has become quite a common or quite a popular approach to research, is because it does allow you to combine the two in a very effective way. So they're going to tell me something happened, but when I watch them, it's probably something a little bit different. But I think we can get insights from both of those ways of collecting data. And if possible, I mean, not always have not more than one data source, but if possible, have more than one data source. So as we say, we have the survey, and it might be that we also have a chat blog or some other way of collecting some more consultative kind of information from our participants. But survey and survey again, and this comes back to the point on the previous slide that we use surveys at different points in our work, and we want to collect different data at different points. So what's the point of the research right now, and how does that feed into future and previous work, and how do we present that back as a cohesive view of insights within the organization?
This leads me to the big debate about interviewing versus serving people. Something you just said is that when you are considering all of the people that you want to survey, for some of them, a different approach may be required. And what we have noticed at Thematic is that some companies actually prefer to use interviews rather than surveys, and either the interviewer types in people's responses, or they just record it and then either use the same types of analysis, or a person basically read everybody's interview. So I actually put together these 5 questions to you, Jenine, to discuss. So one is, when do you recommend to survey and when do you recommend to interview? So one-on-one.
Great question. And I think interview versus survey, I think this is a very important discussion. Interview versus survey comes back to depth versus breadth. So interviews allow you to contact a smaller amount of people, but in a greater detail, whereas survey data allows you to explore a wider audience, but with a less depth. I would recommend, and based on the research I've done and many people that I've worked with, starting out with a qualitative design, so a survey. Let's ask people what we want, what their issues are, much like the open-ended question at the beginning of the survey I suggested before. So let's ask people what their concerns are. Once we've asked them their concerns, then we might design a survey to actually measure some of those concerns. So it might be something like professionalism. I'm interested in professionalism. Well, what does professionalism mean? So the idea of professionalism would come up throughout the survey process, and then we might be able to go and say, well, what issues around professionalism did they bring forward? Then can we pose those as a ticker box, or tell us the most important elements of professionalism for you and feed them back to us that way. So we're trying to take something that's quite unstructured and structured it in a way that people can give feedback.
Great. And what about I think you just answered the second question, but how can you what is an effective way of interviewing? So starting from who should be interviewing, or which questions should they be asking? Should it be scripted? And if not, how can you actually link all the different interviews into one consistent way of analyzing them?
I think there's a couple of things here. So how to best augment a survey, I believe, as part of a wider research process. So having our interviews, and it may be we only ask 3 questions in the interview. It doesn't have to be an hour-long interview. It can be quite short and sharp. And often we ask very similar questions in the survey that we ask in the interview. We just get different responses because of the format, essentially. But certainly having similar questions across both can be quite helpful, because again, it does appeal to different learning styles. Some people feel very confident in an interview sharing their ideas. Others feel very, very uncomfortable and would prefer to do an anonymous survey, or an arm's length survey at least. Who should be interviewing? So somebody with a clear idea of what those insights are that they're after, and who's clearly thought through and designed the questions in a way that we've already discussed. Who should they be interviewing? I would suggest to try to find some key informants within the sample that will give us a range of views. We don't want responses that are all pretty similar. We want to play a bit of devil's advocate here and get different insights across the spectrum through that interview process, so that we get a range of ideas that we can use to develop our survey questions from there. And it can be challenging to make it entertaining. I'm just looking at your next question there. So use really simple language. Examples are good. I don't think it's terrible to give an example of the type of thing you're asking in a question based on previous surveys and things you've done. Guide people as much as possible, but without putting them in a box. Because we want, again, ensuring data consistency, we want them to answer in the way that we want them to, but we don't want to force them. So that does take some skills to design a project like that. Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Collection software. I actually put some software that I came across through our research. And the one at the very top is Google Forms, is one that actually works fairly straightforward. You basically send out a form, it collects it into a Google spreadsheet, and it's free. But tools like SurveyMonkey and SurveyGizmo and Typeform are also very inexpensive survey tools that allow you to actually personalize the survey invite and use some variables as you're writing the email to make it seem more personal. Zendesk and Intercom are both tools for communicating with customers, and you can use them to survey people as well. Qualtrics is a very popular surveying platform, has been around for many, many years. And there are these very specific tools like the Net Promoter Score platform, like Promoter.io, Ask Nicely, Delighted, and others that only focus on one particular type of survey. The great thing about them is you can then communicate with customers and follow up on those who responded and see it all in a very nice dashboard. But the disadvantage is that if you wanted to change your survey to include additional questions, then you're a bit stuck. And the other thing that I found is that there are actually open source software for designing your own surveys. For example, I recently came across a pop-up on our internal wiki run by Atlassian, and I really like that it was very unintrusive, and when you click one of these numbers, it just pop up the open-ended questions below, so it wasn't very destructive, and I was staying in the same context while not needing to leave the page. And there are actually open source tools that you can use to implement similar surveys if you have access to development resources.
It's nice and clean.
Yeah, exactly. So fourth pillar, analyzing, so finding answers and insights, and this is actually what we are doing a lot of at Thematic. So Thematic analyzes customer feedback to tell customers how they can increase customer satisfaction, increase loyalty, and reduce churn. And when we work with companies, we often start with questions. Questions always help interrogate the data, and these are some of the example questions as you're analyzing the results that you can ask yourselves. What are the most common responses to a question? And second one, which responses are affecting or impacting us the most? So the difference between these two is in the first one, we're just looking at the volume, whereas at the second one, we can look at the volume relating to a particular satisfaction score. So if something is very common, it might still not affect the score if it's only mentioned by people who give you the average score. Whereas if, for example, your detractors in an NPS survey is mentioning something a lot, this is affecting the score in a negative way. So these two are important to take hand in hand. You can also look at the data and compare things, either compare a particular time period or compare different slices of data, for example, groups of respondents. And you can also look at a particular issue or theme and then ask questions such as, have customers actually noticed our effort in solving a particular issue? If you are doing a continuous survey over multiple months or years. But of course, getting answers from survey responses is difficult if what you get as a result of a survey is basically a spreadsheet, which is a wall of text and quite difficult to analyze. So what needs to happen first is you need to code your open-ended responses to basically turn them into numbers. Three approaches can be used here. It could be somebody internally coding the data. If you have 100 or 200 responses a month, it's absolutely doable. It has the disadvantage that that person could bring in their biases and just not notice some of the themes that are important unconsciously. The second option is you can outsource it to an agency. You can send it by email even and get the results back if needed. The third option is to use automated coding, text categorization, or theme extraction. So where you basically use algorithms to automatically code the responses and simulate the work of a person doing this. The basic idea is that you basically want to, for each response to an open-ended question, you want to determine into which category does it fall. So in this particular example, friends and family, and family both falls into the second example, so it's coded as 2. Then you can very easily visualize it as a bar chart. Code frames are also can use sentiment. So for example, inserting the positive and the negative layer under customer service helps group things, group the attributes and the themes into positive and negative ones. And I really like this example. So the second, so what happens next is once you've coded, you have this data, and this is an actual example from a manual coding job that that has been done. So you can see in the first little square our spreadsheet with the code frame. So under code value 1, we have applied courses and practical, and the 2 is degree in English. So different topics, different themes that emerge from the data, and the human coder put these together. In the second box, you see the spreadsheet with the actual responses, so the NPS score and NPS category, what they've said, and then up to 5 codes are assigned, and then the for each code, the ID from the code frame is inserted. So the first one has two codes associated with the number 10 and number 36. So this is one way of representing the data, but it's actually quite difficult to analyze it again. So it's much easier to use a software to visualize the analysis of the collected data. And this is where when I want to talk a little bit about the different types of visualizations that can be used. The easiest, as I mentioned, is bar charts. They can be used to visualize frequency and also the impact on a score. Theme clouds is basically a better version of word clouds, where you can see the frequency and the sentiment of a particular theme. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. Then we have the score graphs, where you are tracking a particular score over time. And the fourth one is visualizing key drivers. It usually looks like a coordinates area where you can see all of the themes grouped according to 2 attributes that can be quite helpful. And pivot tables is another really helpful way of analyzing the data. Jenine, you spend a lot of time analyzing data in your research, and you mentioned some self-service software tools that you have been using.
Yeah, thank you, Alyona. A client came to me recently and they had 10,000 surveys that they were analyzing 4 times a year, and they were using Excel. So you can imagine we became very good friends working together, because there had to be a better way. And so my expertise is in using NVivo. I'm an authorized trainer in Australia. And so NVivo software has been around for 30 years, and it's a robust program to help analyze qualitative data across these visualizations. Of course, there are limitations like any software, and that's where Thematic comes in, addressing some of those limitations. It is a paid tool, so there is a budget involved. You can use something like Deduce, which is an online version, a simpler version of NVivo, which allows you to access by a monthly plan. Datacracker and others, there are a variety of tools out there. When we're dealing with data that's almost physically impossible to manage manually, or if we are concerned of bringing in our own biases, or we're just wanting to look longitudinally and compare data over time, there's no option but to use software.
Great. Here are some of the examples that we've put together, and this is a very simple way of visualizing the data, but it's also a very effective one using bar charts. I think it's actually overlooked because typically when people visualize open-ended responses, they use a word cloud. So what we can see here is a screenshot from Thematic, and we have two different slices of data. The blue one has the 1-star and the 2-star reviews of Air New Zealand. And the orange one has the 4 stars and the 5-star air reviews of Air New Zealand. There were not that, it's a really good airline, so there are actually not that many 1- and 2-star reviews, but you can still see clear difference where pricing stands out as the #1 thing that the most frequent theme among those 141 reviews. Whereas when it comes to 4- and 5-star, it's the flight service and more specifically the entertainment that they have. I mentioned score graph. So here we have again a data set with feedback that we've analyzed using Thematic, and you can actually find both the Air New Zealand and this example on our website if you click on the live demo button. But what we can see here is that the customers have been surveyed for the duration of 1 year, and the score used to be around 5, but it's actually started dropping and is now below 3 in July. You can see here down below a theme cloud where you can see themes that are suddenly more frequent and therefore there are errors next to them. The colors denote the sentiment, so update Twitch. Twitch is an app, and these app reviews saying that customers are talking about the update of the app. And another theme that popped up is using the chat, and people are complaining basically that they can't use the chat in landscape mode and they can't see the chat, and you can look at the comments talking about this. Impact is visualized using, again, bar chart, but a very special kind. I think it's called a tornado chart. It looks like a tornado. But here you can see, given 2 different periods, what is driving the score up and down for a financial institution. And finally, I have an example of a pivot table, which I think it's really interesting. So we're looking at a particular theme in open-ended responses, legroom. Again, we're looking at airlines, and we're comparing 1- to 3-star reviews for economy versus 1- to 3-star reviews for first class. And it's called pivot because you're basically pivoting the data. Instead of showing the themes as bar charts, you're showing the number of respondents in different categories for this particular theme. And what we can see here is a Southwest airline does not have a first class. It is a budget airline. But for the remaining one, United, American, and Delta, United has significantly more people complaining about legroom in economy, and American has the least. And when it comes to first class, it's actually Delta that has more people who talk about legroom than any of the airlines. So really nice insight right there. Great, so we're now came to the final slide, so the conclusion slide of our webinar, and I hope that you really enjoyed it. Since Jenine has started the webinar by talking about planning design and the collection, I actually wrote some notes of what really stood out to me. And for when it comes to planning, I thought it was really interesting to think about what customers want and what's in it for them, which many companies don't really think about when they run their surveys. When it comes to design, I thought it was a very interesting idea to use reporting of the results back to the customers as an incentive to actually make them more likely to fill out the survey. When it comes to collection, I thought it was really interesting to use similar questions, but use different techniques such as interview and account for different learning style. Again, something that I didn't think about, and it's so important to make sure that the results that you collect through your survey are diverse and represent a diverse group of people. And when it comes to analyzing, well, we just talked about it, and the key thing is that you need to code open-ended responses in using one of the approaches that I mentioned. And the number one thing is don't use Excel to visualize it.
Agree with that one. Yes.
Jenine, any final comments from you?
Fine. I think that's a great wrap up there, Alyona. Final comment would be coming back to the what's in it for me. Like you say, most organizations don't consider that, and it's a side issue. But if we get the what's in it for me, it actually fixes the incentive problem. It fixes the consistency problem. It actually deals with a whole bunch of those other issues we discussed. So making that one decision probably makes about 100 other decisions.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Well, thank you so much, Jenine, and thanks so much to our attendees as well. It's been great. If you have any questions, we're out of time, but please reach out after this presentation. Feel free to email either myself or Jenine. We'll email you the slides, and we'll email you the recording of the webinar. Thank you so much, and see you on our next webinar that we are already planning. Bye.
Bye.